Good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's good to be here and good to have you here. Thanks for being here. Thanks for checking in. Robert, Corky, Michael, David, great to have you guys here. And getting towards the end of this book, How the Nation Was Won, America's Untold Story by H. Graham Lowry, published by Executive Intelligence Review, EIR, publication of the LaRouche Organization. And you can get more of their stuff at larouchepub.com. Um, when this book is over, I'm going to be looking for something to carry on. And I'm looking very much at the other author from EIR, which is Anton Chaikin, Chaitkin. And uh, sorry if I messed his name up, but anyway, his book called Treason in America, I think I'm be looking at that. Um, yeah, Kennedy's man to smash the CIA, elbow cough. Okay. We would like to continue with the mission, uh, smash the CIA, and that's I guess is our mission here. But let's have some fun this morning by digging back into time and reading the last chapter. And I think we won't finish tonight today, but we'll make some progress in the last chapter of the book called "The Road to the French and Indian War." By the way, I'm broadcasting this morning on both of my channels, both McDuff Lives and on McDuff Lives 2, my backup channel. I'm transitioning back to McDuff Lives since we are now down to one strike, and that gives me the confidence that perhaps we can get back onto McDuff Lives as our main channel because we have over 7,000 subscribers there, and that's just a reach that I want to keep. I want to hang on to those folks, and I appreciate everyone joining both channels because we will need the backup. And so this week I'll be broadcasting on both just to ease the transition, but get ready to jump back fully if you haven't yet over to McDuff Lives. Tonight, Garland Nixon, 8:15 p.m. So that'll be a lot of fun. Hello, Drew. Hello, Freedom. And all right, drink of lemon water here and we'll get started. Just a quick plug, Seeds of Destruction by F. William Engdahl, The Hidden Agenda of Genetic Manipulation, written before what we know now. But really, when you see the handshake on the front there with the, yeah, military, industrial complex. Okay, back to 1745. So the point of the last reading was that finally Lord Fairfax, the proprietor of the Northern Neck, has his property now defined fully by the council in London as the farthest reach of the Potomac, the branch with that it goes the farthest west, and in a straight line from there to the farthest west branch of the source of the Rapidan, which is a tributary of the Rappahannock, which frames between the Potomac and the Rappahannock the Northern Neck as we know it today. But this goes way out to what's called the Fairfax Stone. And if you look at a map of Maryland and you see at the very far left there's a right angle that points downward, uh, that hits the tip of West Virginia. Or there, it kind of it cuts into West Virginia. That point right there, that's the Fairfax Stone, and that is the original place where they marked the source of the Potomac River, all the way out there across or into the mountains. So that is the big deal. Is now you've got a colony with a claim across the mountains, and that opens it up for legal settlement and land sales, of course. New England was already poised to strike a stunning blow against French encirclement of America's frontiers. In the fall of 1744, Governor Shirley of Massachusetts began quietly forming plans for an attack on Louisburg, returning Massachusetts prisoners exchanged for French troops captured in the earlier fighting in Acadia provided him with detailed information based on their confinement inside the supposedly invulnerable fortress on the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. If begun before reinforcements arrived from France the next spring, an overland attack from the rear might succeed. Lewisburg had been designed to control the sea lanes, and the batteries outside the fort were positioned to defend the narrow access to its harbor. On performance, the French would never have expected the British to mount an all out naval assault, and even less imagined that their colonists might attack on their own. Popular sentiment for an expedition against Louisburg grew steadily in Massachusetts once its prisoners had returned. The legislature heard a number of proposals to petition the British government to undertake such a campaign with colonial support, but no action was taken. Governor Shirley wrote to the Duke of Newcastle, warning that Acadia and New England's fisheries were in danger and requesting that British warships be sent for their protection. Still, with no signal from London, Shirley initiated one of the most daring moves in American colonial history. On January the 9th, 1745, he convened the Massachusetts General Court, the name its legislature had been since the days of John Winthrop. He announced that he had a message of such importance that he would deliver it only if the members swore themselves to secrecy. They consented and then heard his astonishing proposal that Massachusetts immediately prepare an expedition against Louisbourg to reduce the greatest French fortress in the New World on the colony's own authority and without the involvement of Britain. Here was a plan worthy of Winthrop's and Mather's in its boldness and calculated to rekindle the Republican sense of identity which had previously distinguished the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Despite the oath taken by the legislators, the secret was soon out, even while they cautiously deliberated for several days. Though Shirley had developed a good working relationship with the general court, more than a streak of stubbornness remained concerning any proposal granting extraordinary authority to a royal governor. In addition, the colony was virtually without funds and had been for some time. In 1741, the British Parliament had rejected the colony's proposals, both for issuing silver coinage and for printing currency backed by a land bank. On the advice of a special joint committee to consider Shirley's plan, the General Court voted to oppose it. The setback was only temporary. Shirley was no stranger to Massachusetts, having moved to Boston in 1731 to practice law and manage the local affairs of friends in London. Through a stint of Advocate General of the British Admiralty Court for New England, he was also familiar with its merchant and shipping interests. They had their own reasons for removing the French fortress and naval port at Louisbourg. As governor, he had come to know even more about the political mood of its citizens. A general backlash had developed, especially in the older cities and towns established by the Puritans, against the corrupt excesses of the Walpole regime. Beginning in 1734, they had also witnessed the danger within, dramatized by a wave of religious irrationalism in the Connecticut River Valley of western Massachusetts, led by Jonathan Edwards. All right, stop for a second. Religious irrationalism. Talking about Jonathan Edwards here. You understand Jonathan Edwards is one of the most important people, considered to be one of the founders of America, one of the people who set our character as Americans. And yet here's Graham Lowry calling him a an irrationalist. Well, we should study a little bit about Jonathan Edwards sometime, but let's just make it a footnote for now and pass on. Now, continuing about Jonathan Edwards. Indoctrinated at Yale in John Locke's psychology of, quote, sensations, Edwards was the grandson of Cotton Mather's bitter enemy, Solomon Stoddard, and the grandfather of some of America's worst traitors, including Aaron Burr, the murderer of Alexander Hamilton. A horde of British-sponsored fundamentalist preachers followed in Edwards's wake, offering mindless subjection to a, quote, loving instead of an angry God. Either way, the intended victim was the morality of Cotton Mather's Essays to Do Good, which insisted that human responsibility, even in government, was the good of mankind. The young Sam Adams, a future leader of the Revolution, had struck the right chord for Massachusetts in 1740, delivering the Salutarian's address at Harvard's commencement. He had called for a revival of, quote, the Puritan Commonwealth of our fathers. Supporters of Governor Shirley's proposal soon circulated a petition signed by some of the leading merchants in the colony, demanding that the General Court reconsider its vote. The legislature had been controlled since the late 1690s by a rigged game of poor versus rich, supervised to make the interests of Massachusetts the loser. Such old habits were hard to break, but the legislature accepted the petition and resumed a lengthy debate. The intelligence gathered by Shirley included reports that the garrison at Louisburg was undermanned and that low morale and dissension among the troops had even led to mutinous incidents. But opponents of the plan called the information unreliable and stressed that in any case Massachusetts lacked the naval power to mount a blockade against reinforcements from France. They further argued that the colonial militia, untested in battle, were no match for French regulars in any case. Supporters, however, had the most telling argument of all. Were Massachusetts to wait for Britain to undertake the attack, the opportunity to seize Louisburg would be lost. By a single vote, the General Court approved the expedition. The long period of stagnation and containment was over. On January 26, 1745, Governor Shirley issued a proclamation directing the people of Massachusetts to prepare for the conquest of Louisburg. On the difficult matter of financing, Shirley had an ace up his sleeve, which enabled him to circumvent British prohibitions on colonial currency issues. He had previously won permission to issue up to £50,000 in bills of credit, quote, to meet any pressing exigency for war. After some wrangling, the legislature approved credits totaling £13,000 to be redeemed from tax revenues over a 10-year period beginning in 1751. The General Court also called 3,250 Massachusetts militiamen to service. Appeals to other colonies brought 500 more from Connecticut and 250 from New Hampshire. Naval requirements were met almost entirely by Massachusetts, with three 26-gun frigates and six ships with 8 to 12 guns, in a squadron totaling over 200 guns, supported by 90 transports. Artillery for the siege consisted of eight 22-pound cannon, 12 9-pounders, four mortar, and 10 18-pound guns from New York. Most of the Massachusetts artillery was stripped from Castle Island, the fort established by John Winthrop commanding Boston Harbor. Shirley had kept the risk of British interference to a minimum from his years in Massachusetts. If nothing else, he certainly knew of the British Navy's sabotage of the 1711 expedition against Quebec. He also knew that transatlantic communications back and forth took nearly 4 months generally, and often more during the winter. On February 1st, he wrote to the Duke of Newcastle informing him of the resolution of the Massachusetts General Court to organize an expedition against Louisburg. On March 24th, the Massachusetts fleet sailed from Nantasket Roads. Only after the troops had embarked did Shirley report to Newcastle the fait accompli that in April New England would besiege the fortress with 4,000 men. He had sought to arrange, however, some additional naval backup against the possible arrival of French warships. To Commodore Peter Warren, at the time commanding a small British squadron of 3 warships at Antigua in the Caribbean, Shirley had sent a special message by ship revealing the plans for the attack on Louisburg and requesting his aid. Warren was known as a friend of the colonies who had married an American and purchased land in New York's Mohawk River Valley, the northern gateway to the west. Commodore Warren presented the appeal to his officers, who insisted they could not take part in any attack made without the approval of the king. Reluctantly, Warren informed Governor Shirley of the decision, who kept the news from all but the senior commanders of the New England forces. The expedition sailed without promise of additional support. But a few days after Warren replied, the Commodore received a long-delayed directive from the Duke of Newcastle, responding to the warning Shirley had sent the previous fall. Warren's squadron was ordered to Boston to join with Shirley in measures, quote, for the annoyance of the enemy and His Majesty's service in North America. Warren took Newcastle's message as sufficient authority to join Shirley's attack and set out for Massachusetts under full sail. The New England forces made their rendezvous in early April at Canseau, at the northeastern tip of Acadia, about 50 miles southwest of Louisburg. An unusually late spring delayed them nearly a month while they waited for the ice around Cape Breton Island to break up. On April 23rd, Warren's 3 ships caught up with the expedition, adding 140 guns to New England's fleet. By Governor Shirley's standing order, Warren took command of the most heavily armed Massachusetts cruisers as well and joined their blockade of the approaches to Lewisburg from the ocean. News that the ice had receded arrived in Canseau on April 27th. 3 days later, the fleet stood off Flat Point on Gabarus Bay, several miles west of Lewisburg, prepared to attack. The plan called for establishing a beachhead near Flat Point, where the full expeditionary force would then land and attack across the narrow neck. Lewisburg lay on the opposite side, with most of its defenses oriented north and east, guarding its inner harbor. Within the fortress, the French had 560 professional soldiers, including several companies of Swiss mercenaries, and roughly 1,300 Canadian militia. In simple numbers, the New England militia held the advantage in ground forces by slightly more than 2 to 1. For an attacking army, however, against the massive fortifications designed by Vauban, that numerical margin was insignificant or non-existent. In sheer firepower as well as position, the French superiority was dramatic. The fortress itself had well over 80 cannon in place, all of them much heavier than the biggest guns in New England's artillery. Outside its walls were two heavy batteries of 30 guns each. Grand Battery northeast of the fort on the harbor's inner shore, and Island Battery built on rocks standing in the mouth of the harbor. The fortress was surrounded on three sides by harbor and ocean. On the landward side, its bastions overlooked a vast marsh, sure to hinder any besieging army. Yet, in Boston, Governor Shirley had designed a plan of attack he was confident would work. A mad scheme, in the words of the Anglophile Francis Parkman, the 19th century New England historian, who cynically produced the most detailed account of the Louisburg campaign. There were four key elements in Shirley's plan of attack, which was premised on throwing the defenders off balance by striking overland against the rear fortifications of Louisburg. The first and most crucial objective was to overrun the detachment defending the Grand Battery and then to turn its heavy guns against the French themselves. The main force of the army was to assault the narrow arm of the fortress at its innermost reach along the harbor's west shore, while the New England batteries dragged their cannon over difficult terrain to siege positions overlooking the western walls. Artillery fire was also to be trained on the Island Battery to level the enemy's primary defense of the harbor entrance. The final ingredient of the strategy was to use the combined naval squadron under Warren to prevent reinforcement of the garrison by sea. In Shirley's mind, this last measure was more precautionary than indispensable. Given political and military realities in Europe, he had no reason to believe that France would dispatch any extraordinary force to accompany the previously scheduled resupply of Louisburg that spring. Warren's three warships were welcome backup, but Shirley had been waiting to proceed without them, counting on the New England squadron to fend off whatever might already be lumbering across the Atlantic from France. Once Louisburg was taken, word would reach London before Paris in any case. Both capitals might be stunned by the victory, but Shirley did not imagine any combination of military responses which might endanger an American held Louisburg. Nor did the French commander of the fortress imagine that any colonial attack might succeed. Through their Indians, the Jesuits had learned of New England's preparations and of the expedition's landing at Canseau. The reports were initially discounted at Louisburg, but there was little its officials could do about the threat anyway. For months, then, for, for more than a month before the attack, New England cruisers had roamed the waters near the harbor in view of the garrison. The occupants of the fortress could only wait and keep a sharp watch toward the sea. Pardon me. Well, Steffi, I see you bought the book and you don't have time to read it. Well, I'm going to have it up on my website. It's at our website, screamingospreys.com. Um, I think we have a playlist already started for the book, but I'll be finishing it in a week or two and make sure we get it up on Screaming Ospreys TV as well. I think it's the kind of book that I'd like to have up as a repertory because so many people don't have any familiarity with the period from 1635 to eight to about 1765. 130 years that were very formative in not only the population but the character of our country. So it's a great thing to have handy. How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry. Definitely go if you want to keep up with George Webb, always check with neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. And you can get in touch with them and check, where George is. I'm afraid he's just kind of gotten driven off of YouTube, and like so many others. But it's a shame that we can't just turn on YouTube and see George anytime we want to. Um, you know, I am very much supportive of Andy and Aaron at Neighborhood News Studio. Great guys that are doing everything they can to keep George's voice active and available. So they've chosen Twitch, and I say we should follow them to Twitch. In Shirley's mind, this. Oh, I already read that. Sorry. On April 30th, 1745, coordinated from the flagship, Shirley, the New England expedition landed at Freshwater Cove above Flat Point, well beyond the range of Louisburg's guns. A French detachment from the fort of 120 men raced to meet them, but were routed by the 100-man landing party, whose casualties totaled 2 men slightly wounded. 2,000 more were on the beach by evening, and the remaining half of the army landed without incident the following day. On March 2nd, Shirley's plan of attack was set into motion, further honed by weeks of drilling while the army had waited at Canso. A Massachusetts division of 400 men, selected to accomplish the first objective, began its mission with a brilliant gesture. Upon reaching the hills above Lewisburg, the militiamen paused to salute the fort and the town within it with 3 cheers. Then, disappearing behind the hills, they marched quickly to a point behind the Grand Battery and proceeded to set fire to the magazines and supply warehouses on the northwestern shore of the inner harbor. The Grand Battery's detachment, numbering by French accounts 400 men, panicked in the face of these unexpected moves and received permission to withdraw to the fort. The next morning, when the heavy smoke from the burning storehouses had cleared, Massachusetts soldiers discovered that the battery had been abandoned. Its munitions had only been partly disposed of, and its 42-pound cannon were intact, save for the spikes in their match holes. 4 boatloads of French troops crossed the harbor from the fort to reclaim the battery, but were held off on the beach by a dozen or so Massachusetts men until their own reinforcements arrived. A unit of engineers under Major Seth Pomeroy, a gunsmith from Northampton, proceeded to unspike the guns and train them on the fortress. The lighter Massachusetts artillery, commanded by the expert engineer Richard Gridley, had been equipped with 42-pound shot expressly for this purpose. The next morning, as a French eyewitness reported, quote, the enemy saluted us with their own cannon and made a terrific fire, smashing everything within range. Lewisburg still possessed plenty of firepower. A weeks long siege ensued, during which the Massachusetts gunners often had to maintain a furious barrage simply to hold their initial positions against artillery and rifle fire from the 50-acre fortress. The island battery remained intact. Munitions and supplies were running low on both sides, but a protracted stalemate could only favor the French. From mainland Quebec, the Jesuits had managed to bring hundreds of Indians who harassed positions behind New England's lines, taking numbers of prisoners who were tortured and murdered. On May the 19th, French warship Vigilant had appeared off Great Cape Breton Island with 64 guns and 560 men, bringing munitions and supplies for Louisburg. Intercepted by the Shirley and chased into the midst of the blockading squadron, the French vessel soon surrendered. Commodore Warren reported prisoners' accounts to the effect that more French vessels were on the way, which later proved to be false. Such claims did not deter the New Englanders. Employing the munitions from the Vigilant for their own use, they stepped up the barrage against Louisburg. But a militia assault against the island battery was repulsed on the night of May 26th, and the first wave of 120 men who landed were taken prisoner. The French claimed many more were killed or drowned. Within the fortress, the garrison cheered, still unaware of the fate of the Vigilant. Heavy fire from New England's batteries, however, continued to pour into Lewisburg. Its rear bastions were damaged. The walls of its main gate were crumbling, and the houses of the town were all but obliterated. The long siege had taken its toll. Under direction of Colonel Gridley, chief of the Massachusetts artillery, a battery was established at Lighthouse Point at the eastern mouth of the harbor, directly in line with the island battery. The position was considered inaccessible, but was attained by hauling cannon up a steep cliff and dragging them more than a mile to the point overlooking the target. Gridley's artillery then bombarded the island battery with such precision that the French soldiers ran more than once into the sea for refuge. Many of their heavy guns were blown off their mountings and rendered useless. The same fate was descending upon the French batteries within the fortress. The surrender of Louisburg, supposedly invincible, was merely a matter of time. New England's capture of Louisburg sent shock waves across the capitals of Europe. The astonishing feat upset the prevailing rules of warfare, and especially the managed system of mutual mayhem known as preserving the balance of power. Particularly in Britain and France, new calculations began to be made on the possibility that America might assert its independence. Though British policy was to give New England as little credit as possible for the accomplishment, the facts of the matter soon became widely known. A French witness of the siege wrote, "It was an enterprise less of the English nation and its king than of the inhabitants of New England alone. This singular people have their own laws and administration, and their governor plays the sovereign. Admiral Warren had no authority over the troops sent by the governor of Boston, and he was only a spectator. Nobody would have said that the sea and land forces were of the same nation and under the same prince. No nation but the English is capable of such eccentricities, which nevertheless are part of the precious liberty of which they show themselves so jealous." Unquote. Isn't that a nice quote? The precious liberties. Don't forget Garland Nixon tonight. He's always very insightful and incisive. He's a brilliant man with a great perspective on our current events. So that'll be tonight at 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. There was jubilation throughout the colonies over the victory at Louisburg. Word reached Boston on July 3rd, 1745. At 1 o'clock in the morning, bells pealed and cannon roared despite the hour. Before dawn, cheering throngs filled the streets. Celebrations continued throughout the day and into the night, when fireworks and bonfires added to the brightness of the occasion. New York and Philadelphia greeted the news with similar displays, and everywhere people eagerly anticipated removing the French threat at last. New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania authorized funds to reduce the financial burden of Massachusetts and to maintain the colonial garrison at Louisburg. As far south as Virginia, plans for the conquest of Canada were rapidly being drawn up. Such general enthusiasm among the colonies meant only one thing: on the issue of opening the West, and therefore of nation building, they might readily unite. That message was not lost in London. The American question was pulling apart the synthetic consensus of George II's war ministry. Both British and French oligarchical interests were already at work, redrawing future settlements to preserve their joint containment of America. Let's wait for a second and let's make a little note about this, because this is Graham Lowry's uh, genius, I think, putting this together. And I want to actually make the point that it fits very well with what we've been reading from Tupper Saucy in Rulers of Evil. So let me indulge me for a minute while I develop this point. The Jesuits are controlling certain Indian tribes that they can weaponize and turn into terrorists, kind of like an Ed Lansdale of 1740, right? It goes out and does terrible, terrible, horrible things in order to instill fright and control people through fear. And that provides the northern and western backstop against which the colonies cannot grow. On the other side, you have the British establishment, which is also keeping the colonies from growing because that's how they exploit them, by using the colonists as, cheap labor, and enslaved people as cheap labor or free labor, controlling the vast, you know, thousands of acres of land, under a single proprietor like Lord Fairfax, like Lord Baltimore in Maryland, and basically using a pyramid like system, of a hierarchical feudal system in which the stuff rolls downhill and the money goes uphill. And that's the old way. That's what the Declaration of Independence is supposed to be freeing us from. Okay. So that is the oligarchical British system that is keeping us from growing on the one side. And then you have the Catholic Church that acting through the Jesuits, the military order, using proxies to constrain us on the other side so that we will always be serfs and will never be free. And this is Governor Shirley of Massachusetts who's making a statement saying, no, no, we're not going to put up with this any longer. We are establishing our own army, our own navy. We're gonna maintain ourselves as independent. And that was inevitable, I guess. But see, the importance of it is manipulation of us by the the two extremes, like the Masonic temple, the pillars on the one pillar on the left and the other pillar on the right, and they kind of keep us squeezed in between them, Jesuits and Freemasons, if you will, in the British royalty. So both British and French oligarchical interests were already at work redrawing future settlements to preserve their joint containment of America. While those arrangements proceeded, official British policy was to project the illusion of supporting the colony's hopes until the opportunity to take Canada had passed. For the time being, Louisburg was to be held at American expense, with nothing more from Britain. Then the promise that the garrison would be relieved by troops from Gibraltar. Excuse me. Governor Shirley and William Pepperell, the commander he had chosen for New England's troops, were named colonels of the British Army to command regiments to be raised in America. They were to supply any relief of Louisburg until British troops arrived. The powers in London had decided to let Shirley twist in the wind. On April 4th, 1745, even before the New England expedition had completed its rendezvous at Canseau, Shirley had written to Newcastle that if the mission succeeded, New England and the other colonies would eagerly undertake the conquest of Canada. Beyond having made his intentions clear from the outset, Shirley now represented an even greater danger. Both the military and political outcomes of the campaign were exactly as he had projected. In the summer of 1745, over 3,000 New England militiamen remained encamped at Louisburg. Their siege of the fortress had been so devastating that any talk of a garrison might have seemed ludicrous. Living quarters within the walls had been largely reduced to ruin. The drinking wells were dangerously contaminated, and the island was completely dependent on external supplies. Only a major military and civil reconstruction effort could make Louisburg into a fortress once more. 2 months passed with no sign of any intention from the government of King George II. Foul odors from London were soon detected in Boston, and rumors spread that Britain was plotting to return Louisburg to the French. Shirley reported little progress in recruiting to the new regiment since a number of commissions had been claimed for the British Army, and men will not enlist here except under American officers. In August, Shirley had to travel to Lewisburg and exert his personal authority to quell a mutinous mood in the militia. The death toll was rising. He managed to get Warren's British seamen to cooperate with New England's militiamen in building a mess hall, barracks, and latrines, as well as a hospital to treat those with dysentery and other illnesses. Week after week, he supervised the effort while waiting nearly 2 months for the relief promised from Britain. Still, none came, and in late October, he returned to Boston. Whatever future role in life Shirley might have imagined as a young Englishman seeking his way during the last years of Queen Anne, he had attained a position of historical responsibility. He was the royal governor of Massachusetts, yet he had become an official advocate of the policies which Hanoverian Britain feared most. He realized that even before he mobilized the expedition against Louisburg, and he knew even more after it succeeded, he did not retreat. From Boston, he informed the British ministry that it were easier to recruit 10,000 Americans for an attack at Canada than to find 1,000 willing to lie idle at Louisburg or anywhere else. Defeating the French in Canada was the most effectual means of securing the whole northern continent as far back as the French settlements on the lower Mississippi, which are about 2,000 miles distant. Unquote. He offered the modest estimate that without French containment, the population of the American colonies would rival that of France within a century or so. He was confident that should His Majesty command it, America would raise 20,000 men against Canada to ensure such a prospect. While Shirley waited for a reply to his proposals, his men at Louisburg were forced to endure a much longer vigil. Nearly 10 months after the French surrender, there was still no sign of the relief promised from Britain. Fevers, dysentery, and inadequate supplies left the American garrison in poor condition to face the winter. By the time the modest detachment of troops from Gibraltar arrived in April 1746, nearly 900 New England militiamen had died waiting for them. The survivors finally sailed for home, bringing with them a deepening hatred of British rule. And at page 500, we will conclude this reading this morning. About 5 minutes to noon gives you time to get ready for whatever's up at noon. I suspect that George is going to be on soon, but I, like the rest of you, I haven't been able to see a, a certain calendar. But anyway, encourage you to get over to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com and follow uh, what's posted there, because that's the best way to keep up with George and Andy and Aaron. And Andy has a show in the evenings. I think he's back on YouTube now. Anyway, we do what we have to spread the news and share the hope. The strength of the pack, the hope, the belief, the idea that we're special. We're humans. We have human rights. Uh, we were endowed by our Creator with them, and we won't give them up because that's what makes us, who we are as Americans.